My husband's best man kissed me at the altar. She deserves better than you, he told my groom. The church erupted. But what nobody knew. We'd planned this moment. To expose what my fiancé had been hiding. Will you marry me? Aiden's voice cracked on the last word, his knees hitting our dining room floor with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent house. I sat frozen in my chair watching the scene unfold like a car accident in slow motion. My 28-year-old sister Sophia stared down at him, her face draining of color as the massive diamond ring caught the warm glow of Mom's cherished chandelier. This wasn't how Sunday dinner was supposed to go. Sophia's hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass, then thought better of it. Her lips parted slightly but no words came. Across the mahogany table that had hosted countless family celebrations, Mom clutched her pearls while Dad's pot roast grew cold on his forgotten fork. Sophia. Aiden pressed, his voice carrying a desperate edge that made my chest tighten. I've been thinking about this for months. We could have such a beautiful life together. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories that matter. If you believe that women deserve to trust their instincts and recognize true love from manipulation, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how this devastating betrayal unfolds. I'd watched my sister navigate suitors for years, always with grace and kindness. But something about Aiden had been different from the start. More intense. More possessive. The way he showed up at her hospital with elaborate flower arrangements that embarrassed her in front of colleagues. How he'd somehow inserted himself into every family gathering, every conversation about Sophia's future. Aiden, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of Dad's grandfather clock. I'm honored truly, but I can't accept this. The transformation in his face was instant and terrifying. The loving, devoted suitor vanished, replaced by something raw and wounded that made my skin crawl. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working beneath his skin. I don't understand, he said, still on his knees but gripping the ring box like a weapon. We've been together for months. I thought you cared about me. I do care about you, Sophia said, her nursing training kicking in as she tried to de-escalate the situation. But as a friend, my heart belongs to someone else. The words hit Aiden like a physical blow. He rocked back on his heels, his face cycling through disbelief, hurt, and something darker that made my stomach clench with unease. When he finally stood, his movements were jerky, unnatural. Someone else, he repeated, and there was venom in his voice now. Someone you've been hiding from all of us? Sophia's eyes darted toward the kitchen where Ryan had disappeared to help Mom with dessert. It was just a glance, barely a second, but Aiden caught it. We all did. The pieces clicked into place with an almost audible snap. Ryan. Aiden's best friend since college. The man who'd been like a brother to both Sophia and me for years. The one who'd been acting strange lately, formal and distant whenever Aiden and Sophia were together. I see, Aiden said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than any shout. How long? Aiden, please, Sophia started, but he held up a hand to silence her. How long have you been sleeping with my best friend? The crude words shattered what was left of our family dinner. Mom gasped audibly. Dad's chair scraped against the hardwood as he started to stand, his protective instincts kicking in. But it was the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen that made us all turn. Ryan stood in the doorway, Mom's good serving bowl in pieces at his feet, his face pale as parchment. He looked between Sophia and Aiden with the expression of a man who knew his secret was out. It's not what you think, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Aiden's laugh was bitter, ugly. My best friend and the woman I love sneaking around behind my back. How perfectly cliché. I wanted to say something, anything to break the terrible tension filling our dining room. But I was frozen watching my family implode over dessert and coffee. This was supposed to be a normal Sunday. Sophia was supposed to say yes. We were supposed to be celebrating. Instead, Aiden stormed out, pausing only to slam the ring box down on our dining table hard enough to make the dishes jump. The front door rattled on its hinges when he left, and then we were alone with the wreckage of what should have been a joyful moment. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of awkward family dinners where no one mentioned Aiden's name. 3 weeks of Sophia walking around with a glow that had nothing to do with her skincare routine and everything to do with finally being able to love Ryan openly. 3 weeks of me watching from the sidelines, the perpetual older sister, the one who'd focused so hard on her career that romance had passed her by entirely. Until yesterday. I was in my home office reviewing contracts for the architectural firm I'd spent 15 years building when my doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass I could see a familiar silhouette, but something about the posture was different. More confident. Almost triumphant. When I opened the door, Aiden stood there with a smile so brilliant it could have powered the entire neighborhood. He looked different somehow. Lighter. Like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Nicole," he said, stepping inside without invitation. "I need to talk to you about something important." My living room felt smaller with him in it. He moved through the space like he belonged there, examining the family photos on my mantel, running his fingers along the spines of books on my coffee table. There was something proprietary about his behavior that should have set off alarm bells. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night at your parents' house," he began, settling onto my sofa without being asked. "About life, about love, about what really matters." What followed was the most surreal conversation of my adult life. Aiden spoke eloquently about how Sophia's rejection had opened his eyes, how he'd realized his feelings for her had been superficial infatuation. He talked about maturity, about the difference between fleeting attraction and lasting compatibility. "I've always admired you, Nicole," he said, leaning forward with those intense brown eyes fixed on mine. "Your strength, your independence, the way you've built such a successful career. Sophia is beautiful, but you're substantial. You're the kind of woman a man builds a life with." At 52 I'd grown accustomed to being invisible to men like Aiden. Successful, attractive men in their 40s who typically pursued women young enough to be their daughters. My last serious relationship had ended 3 years ago when my partner decided he wanted children with someone who could still provide them. So when Aiden pulled out another velvet box, this one containing a different ring he claimed, one he'd chosen specifically for me, my rational mind screamed warnings I refused to hear. "I know this seems sudden," he said, taking my left hand in both of his. "But when you know, you know. I want to spend my life with you, Nicole. I want to build something meaningful together." The diamond was larger than Sophia's would have been, set in platinum rather than gold. It caught the afternoon light streaming through my windows and threw tiny rainbows across my walls. When he slid it onto my finger, it fit perfectly. "Yes," I heard myself say, the word escaping before my brain could catch up. "Yes, I'll marry you." His reaction should have been my first warning. There was relief in his expression, certainly, but none of the joy I'd expected from a man whose marriage proposal had just been accepted. Instead, he seemed almost businesslike, immediately launching into discussions about timeline and venue. "Why wait?" he asked when I mentioned a long engagement. "We're not children who need years to figure out compatibility. We can have a beautiful spring wedding. Maybe at St. Mary's where your parents were married." When I called my parents that evening, their surprise was palpable even through the phone. Mom's voice climbed several octaves as she processed the information. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she finally managed. "Very unexpected but wonderful. Are you sure this is what you want?" The doubt in her voice stung, but I pushed it aside. They'd always seen me as the sensible sister, the one who thought everything through carefully. Maybe they simply couldn't adjust to seeing me make a spontaneous romantic decision. The most difficult conversation was with Sophia. When I showed up at her apartment the next morning, ring gleaming on my finger, she answered the door in pajamas with hair that suggested a sleepless night. "Congratulations," she said, but the word came out flat, lifeless. "I hope you'll be very happy together." We sat in her sunny kitchen with untouched coffee growing cold between us. I waited for her to share in my excitement, to offer sisterly advice about wedding planning. Instead, she stared out her window at the bird feeder, watching cardinals compete for seeds. "Are you upset about this?" finally asked. "You're both adults," she replied, the same phrase she would repeat whenever anyone asked about my engagement. "You can make your own decisions." But her body language told a different story. She kept her arms wrapped around herself like armor, and when I tried to show her the ring up close, she barely glanced at it. Ryan's reaction was even stranger. When I stopped by his apartment to share my news, his usual warm smile faltered the moment he saw my expression. "Don't you think this is all happening very fast?" he asked after I explained about Aiden's proposal. "Maybe," I admitted, "but sometimes you just know, right?" Ryan stared at his hands for a long moment. When he looked up, his blue eyes were troubled. Has he said anything about Sophia? About why he changed his mind so quickly? The question struck me as inappropriate. He realized his feelings for her weren't real, I explained. He says what he feels for me is deeper, more mature. Right, Ryan said, but he didn't sound convinced. That night, lying in bed with my new ring catching moonlight from my bedroom window, I should have been planning my future. Instead, I found myself replaying conversations, analyzing glances, trying to decode the strange undercurrents that seemed to swirl around my engagement. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Everyone's reactions seemed muted, careful, like they were all keeping secrets. Even Aiden himself seemed different now that I'd said yes. More confident, almost smug. But I was 52 years old and finally being pursued by a handsome, successful man who claimed to value my maturity and accomplishments. The romantic in me, buried under years of practicality and disappointment, refused to listen to reason. I was getting married. After all these years of watching from the sidelines while Sophia collected hearts like trophies, I was the one walking down the aisle. What could possibly go wrong? The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick with legal documents that made my coffee taste bitter. Aiden sat across from me at my kitchen table, his tie loosened from another early morning at his consulting firm, spreading papers across the wooden surface like he was preparing for battle. Prenuptial agreements are just smart business, Nicole, he said, tapping his pen against a particularly dense paragraph. Successful couples plan for every scenario. I stared at the documents, my stomach churning as I read phrases like asset disclosure and financial transparency requirements. The papers weren't just about protecting what we'd bring into the marriage. They were about combining everything we owned into one legal entity. This section here, Aiden continued, pointing to a highlighted clause, just ensures we have access to each other's accounts. Complete transparency. No secrets between us. The way he said, no secrets, made my skin prickle. There was something hungry in his expression as he watched me read, like a predator waiting for prey to walk into a trap. I've never shared my business accounts with anyone, I said slowly. Even my parents don't have access to those. His face shifted instantly, the mask of understanding slipping to reveal something wounded and accusatory. Don't you trust me? It's not about trust, it's exactly about trust. He reached across the table, covering my hand with his. We're going to be married, Nicole. Husband and wife. If you can't trust me with something as simple as bank account numbers, what does that say about our future together? The guilt hit me like a physical weight. Here was this man who claimed to love me, who wanted to build a life together, and I was already putting up walls. Maybe he was right. Maybe my reluctance came from years of being single, of protecting myself from disappointment. I just need time to think about it, I said. Of course. His smile returned, but it felt forced now. Take all the time you need. We have weeks before the wedding. The way he said weeks made it sound like a deadline rather than a timeline. That same afternoon, Aiden brought up the family trust while we walked through the botanical gardens downtown. Cherry blossoms drifted around us like confetti, and couples strolled hand in hand along winding paths. It should have been romantic. Your father mentioned the trust fund last Sunday, he said casually, stopping to admire a fountain where children tossed pennies and made wishes. It's wonderful how your family thinks about legacy. I'd grown up knowing about the trust. Dad's construction business had done well over the decades, and he'd set aside money for Sophia and me, along with any future spouses and children. It wasn't a fortune, but it was security. Adding me as a beneficiary would be such a meaningful gesture, Aiden continued. A way of officially welcoming me into the family. That's not really how it works, I said, watching a little girl chase bubbles across the grass. The trust has specific rules about. Rules can be changed. His hand tightened on mine. Your parents adore me, Nicole. I'm sure they'd be happy to include their new son-in-law. Son-in-law. The words sounded strange coming from him, almost possessive. Like he was already claiming a title he hadn't earned yet. The comments about Sophia started small, little barbs disguised as observations. We'd be having dinner at a nice restaurant, and he'd mention how Sophia always seemed to order the most expensive item on the menu. Or we'd see a young woman laughing loudly with friends and he'd shake his head and say, reminds me of your sister. Always needing to be the center of attention. Sophia's not like that, I'd protest, but he'd just smile and change the subject. The comparisons became more frequent, more cutting. You're so much more grounded than Sophia, he'd say, stroking my hair as we watched television. She's all surface, no substance. I was such a fool to think someone like her could appreciate genuine love. Each comment felt like a small betrayal of my sister, but they also fed something needy inside me. For years, I'd watched Sophia effortlessly attract admiration while I faded into the background. Hearing Aiden praise my maturity, my stability, felt like validation I'd craved my entire adult life. Your sister never appreciated what she had, he said one evening as we planned seating arrangements for the reception. Always looking for something better, something more exciting. She has no idea what real commitment means. She's happy with Ryan, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if that was true. Sophia had been acting strange lately, distant, preoccupied, like she was carrying a weight she couldn't share. Ryan. Aiden's jaw tightened whenever his former best friend's name came up. My mistake was trusting someone who'd stab me in the back the moment it was convenient. The bitterness in his voice when he talked about Ryan was frightening in its intensity. These were two men who'd been inseparable since college, who'd stood up at each other's graduations, who'd planned to be each other's best men. Now Aiden spoke about Ryan like he was discussing a stranger who'd wronged him. It was during one of Mom's famous Thursday evening dinners that I first noticed something was seriously wrong. Sophia and Ryan had arrived together, their fingers intertwined, but there was tension radiating from both of them that made the dining room feel smaller. Sophia barely touched her food, pushing Mom's famous lasagna around her plate while Ryan kept checking his phone. When Aiden made another subtle dig about people who abandoned their friends for a pretty face, Ryan's knuckles went white around his fork. "Excuse me," Sophia said suddenly, standing so quickly her chair scraped against the hardwood. "I need some air." She headed for the back door that led to Mom's garden, where roses climbed trellises and herb beds perfumed the evening air. Ryan followed without a word, leaving the rest of us in awkward silence. "Everything all right?" Dad asked, but no one had an answer. 10 minutes later I went looking for them. The garden was peaceful in the fading light, fireflies beginning their nightly dance among the flower beds. But the voices coming from behind the gazebo were anything but peaceful. "She has to know," Sophia was saying, her voice thick with tears. "We can't let this happen." "You think I don't want to tell her?" Ryan's voice was rough with frustration. "But who's going to believe us? He's got everyone convinced he's some heartbroken romantic who found true love with her sister. Before it's too late, Ryan. Before she marries him, Anne." They saw me then, standing frozen on the garden path with my heart hammering against my ribs. Sophia's face was streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. Ryan looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usually neat hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled. "Nicole," Sophia started, but I could see her mind racing, trying to find words that wouldn't sound crazy. "Is everything okay?" I asked, though it clearly wasn't. "We were just discussing the wedding," Ryan said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "Guest lists and logistics." The lie hung between us like smoke. This wasn't their first difficult conversation. I could see it in the way they looked at each other, in the familiar pattern of Sophia's tears and Ryan's helpless frustration. "The wedding's in 3 weeks," I said slowly. "Is there something I should know?" They exchanged another look, one of those wordless conversations that people have when they've shared secrets for too long. Then Sophia wiped her eyes and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just stress," she said. "Planning a wedding is overwhelming." But I was planning the wedding, not them. And the stress I was seeing had nothing to do with flower arrangements or catering choices. When I brought up their strange behavior to Aiden that night, he dismissed it with an easy laugh. "Ryan's probably jealous," he said, pulling me closer on the couch. "Here I am marrying a successful, beautiful woman while he's stuck with Sophia." "What do you mean, stuck?" "Come on, Nicole. Your sister's fun to look at, but what does she offer beyond that? Ryan's a smart guy. He'll figure out pretty soon that he's dating a child in a woman's body." The cruelty in his words made me flinch, but he was already moving on, spreading wedding venue brochures across the coffee table like nothing had happened. "Now about the honeymoon," he said, his finger tracing a circle around photos of a resort in the Caribbean. "I was thinking somewhere we could really relax and discuss our future plans. Maybe talk about those investment opportunities your father mentioned. Every conversation somehow circled back to money, to business, to ways our families could support each other financially. When I mentioned my discomfort with mixing romance and business, Aiden would look hurt and confused. "I'm just trying to build a future for us," he'd say. "Don't you want us to be successful together?" The wedding invitations had been sent, the venue booked, the dress altered. 200 people were planning to witness our union at St. Mary's Cathedral. My parents had already spent thousands on flowers and catering. The momentum felt unstoppable, like being carried downstream by a current too strong to fight. But late at night, when Aiden was at his own apartment and I was alone with my thoughts, doubts crept in like shadows. The way he talked about money felt calculated rather than romantic. His comments about Sophia seemed designed to make me feel superior rather than loved. And the fear in Ryan and Sophia's eyes when they thought no one was watching. At 52, I'd learned to second-guess my instincts, especially about men and relationships. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe years of being alone had made me suspicious of genuine affection. Maybe the little voice whispering warnings was just my own insecurity talking. 3 weeks until the wedding. 3 weeks until I became Mrs. Aiden McCormick and started the life I'd always dreamed of having. So why did I feel like I was walking toward a cliff with my eyes closed? The morning of my wedding dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains of the bridal suite at St. Mary's Cathedral. I stood before the antique mirror, adjusting my grandmother's pearl necklace for the 100th time, trying to quiet the butterflies that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. "You look absolutely radiant," Mom whispered, stepping behind me to smooth an invisible wrinkle from my dress. The ivory silk had cost more than my first car, but seeing myself in it made me feel like the bride I'd always dreamed of being. At 52, I'd never expected to wear white again, never imagined walking down an aisle while organ music swelled around me. The pearl earrings had belonged to Grandmother Elizabeth, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd promised to love, honor, and cherish. As I fastened them, I could almost hear her voice telling me that true love was worth waiting for, no matter how long it took to find. 5 minutes, ladies," called Father Matthews through the door. My heart hammered against my ribs as Mom gathered my train, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" I nodded, though ready felt like too simple a word for the complex emotions swirling through me. Excitement, yes. Hope, certainly. But underneath it all, a persistent whisper of unease that I'd been trying to silence for weeks. The cathedral doors opened and 200 faces turned toward me. The nave was a garden of white roses and baby's breath, candles flickering like fallen stars against the ancient stone walls. The organ's opening notes of Pachelbel's canon filled the vaulted space, and suddenly I was floating down the aisle on Dad's steady arm. Aiden waited at the altar in his charcoal gray tuxedo, looking every inch the successful businessman who'd swept me off my feet. But something was off about his posture, the way his eyes kept darting toward the packed pews instead of focusing on me. His hands fidgeted with his cufflinks and I caught him checking his watch twice during my walk down the aisle. "Nervous?" I whispered as Dad placed my hand in Aiden's. "Just eager to make you my wife," he replied, but his smile felt forced, rehearsed. His palm was damp with perspiration as his fingers closed around mine. The congregation settled into expectant silence as Father Matthews raised his hands to begin the ceremony. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the marble floor. In the front row, Mom dabbed at her eyes while Dad sat ramrod straight in his best suit. "Dearly beloved," Father Matthews began, his voice carrying easily through the cathedral's perfect acoustics, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Nicole Elizabeth Hartman and Aiden Patrick McCormick in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over me like a blessing. This was really happening. After years of watching other people's happiness from the sidelines, I was finally the star of my own love story. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," Father Matthews continued, "built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. It requires 2 people to come together in complete openness, hiding nothing from each other." Aiden's grip on my hand tightened almost painfully. When I glanced at him, his jaw was clenched, a muscle working beneath his carefully shaved cheek. Sweat beaded along his hairline despite the cathedral's cool temperature. If anyone here present knows of any reason why these 2 should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and someone's muffled cough. I relaxed slightly, ready to move forward with the vows that would make us husband and wife. That's when Ryan stood up. He rose from his seat in the third pew with the careful deliberation of a man who'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. Every head in the cathedral turned toward him, a collective intake of breath creating a sound like wind through autumn leaves. "Ryan, don't," Aiden hissed, but Ryan was already walking forward, his footsteps echoing off the stone floor with the finality of a judge's gavel. Time seemed to slow as he approached the altar. I could see individual dust motes dancing in the colored light from the windows, could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The congregation held its collective breath, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. Ryan stopped directly in front of me, his blue eyes filled with a pain so deep it made my chest ache. He looked exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept in weeks, but there was also something like relief in his expression. "I'm sorry, Nicole," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustics. "But I can't let this happen." Before I could process what he meant, before Aiden could step between us, Ryan cupped my face in his hands and kissed me. It wasn't a romantic kiss. There was nothing passionate or lustful about it. Instead, it felt desperate, urgent, like a drowning man gasping for air. His lips were warm and gentle, but I could feel him trembling with the weight of whatever had driven him to this moment. The kiss lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but in that frozen instant, I felt the entire cathedral holding its breath. 150 guests sat in stunned silence, witnesses to something that would be talked about for decades. When Ryan pulled away, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She deserves better than you," he said, turning to face Aiden with a steady voice that carried every ounce of his conviction. The words hit like a thunderclap in the sudden silence. I stood frozen, my hand flying to my lips, trying to process what had just happened. Around us, the congregation erupted in whispers and gasps, the sound building like approaching storm clouds. Aiden's face had gone white except for 2 spots of color burning high on his cheekbones. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike Ryan where he stood. "How dare you?" Aiden snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "How dare you come here and—" He never finished the sentence. Instead, his hand whipped through the air, connecting with Ryan's cheek in a slap that cracked through the cathedral like a gunshot. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling, followed by another collective gasp from the congregation. Ryan's head snapped to the side, but he didn't stumble. Didn't raise his hands to defend himself. He simply straightened, touching his reddening cheek with the tips of his fingers, and looked back at Aiden with something that might have been pity. "I expected that," he said quietly. "I expected worse." The complete lack of surprise in his voice chilled me more than the violence itself. This confrontation hadn't been spontaneous. Ryan had planned this moment, had walked into our wedding knowing exactly what would happen. "Security!" Aiden shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Get this maniac out of here." But no one moved. The ushers stood frozen in the aisles, as stunned as everyone else. Father Matthews gripped his prayer book like a shield, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. That's when I heard the rustle of fabric behind me. Sophia had risen from her seat in the front pew, her face pale but determined. She looked directly at me, tears streaming down her cheeks, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the cathedral. "You deserve to know what he planned." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled guests. I felt my knees go weak, my grandmother's pearls suddenly feeling like a noose around my throat. "Sophia, no," Aiden warned, but my sister stepped into the aisle, moving toward us with the same purposeful stride Ryan had shown. "She has a right to know," Ryan said, his hand still pressed to his burning cheek. "They all do." The congregation began to stir, confusion and anticipation mixing in the charged atmosphere. I could see my parents in the front row, Dad half risen from his seat with his face flushed red, Mom clutching her purse like a lifeline. "Know what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the growing murmur of voices. "What are you talking about?" Sophia reached us then, positioning herself between me and Aiden like a shield. When she looked at me, her eyes held months of suppressed anguish, secrets that had been eating her alive. "Tell her, Ryan," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Tell everyone what you heard him say." The cathedral fell silent again, every person straining to hear what would come next. Aiden took a step backward, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for me to read. But in his eyes I saw something that made my blood run cold. Fear. I don't know what game you think you're playing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction now. But this is neither the time nor the place for your jealous fantasies. Isn't it? Ryan reached into his jacket pocket, producing something that glinted in the stained glass light. Because I think our guests might be very interested in what you really think about your bride. My heart stopped as I recognized what he held in his hand. A phone. With a recording ready to play. Don't, Aiden said, lunging toward Ryan's phone with the desperation of a man watching his life unravel. You have no right. But Ryan stepped back, holding the device out of reach, his finger hovering over the play button like a judge about to deliver a verdict. The cathedral had become a courtroom and I was standing trial for my own naivety. Everyone here deserves to know what kind of man Nicole was about to marry, Ryan said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vaulted space. I looked at Sophia standing in the aisle with tears streaming down her face, and suddenly understood why she'd been crying in the garden that night. Why she'd looked at me with such pain every time wedding planning came up. Why she'd grown distant and withdrawn as my wedding day approached. Sophia, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the murmur of confused guests. Tell me what's happening. My sister took a shuddering breath, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. When she looked at me, I saw years of protective instincts warring with the knowledge that the truth would destroy me. He never loved you, Nicole, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. He researched our entire family before he ever asked me out. He knew about Dad's business, about the trust fund, about every asset we own. The words hit me like physical blows. I felt my knees buckle and Father Matthews reached out to steady me, his face pale with shock. That's ridiculous, I managed, but even as I said it, memories were shifting in my mind like puzzle pieces finding their proper places. All those questions about Dad's construction company. The way he'd casually mentioned the family trust. His interest in our property investments. He had a file, Nicole, Sophia continued, stepping closer despite Aiden's furious glare. Photos of our house, printouts of property records, even old newspaper articles about Dad's business awards. He knew exactly how much our family was worth before he ever said hello to me. The cathedral was silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting to see how I would react to having my life demolished in front of them. He told me he loved me, I said weakly, clinging to the only truth I thought I still had. He told me he loved me too, Sophia replied, her voice gentle but firm. Right up until I turned down his proposal and he realized I wouldn't be his ticket to our family's money. Aiden's face had gone from pale to red to a sickly gray color. She's lying, he said, but his voice cracked on the words. Sophia's always been jealous of what we have. She can't stand seeing her sister happy. Is that why you researched my medical school debt? Sophia asked, pulling a folded paper from her purse. Because you thought I was too broke to be worth your time? She unfolded what looked like a credit report, holding it up for everyone to see. He had this run 3 days before our first date. Along with Nicole's credit report and a full financial background check on our entire family. The paper trembled in her hands, but her voice remained steady. You want to know what convinced me he didn't really love me? He asked me to co-sign a loan on our second date. Said it was for a romantic surprise, but I found out later he was trying to use my credit to buy an engagement ring he couldn't afford. My stomach lurched as another memory surfaced. The beautiful diamond ring that had fit my finger perfectly. The one he claimed he'd chosen specifically for me. The ring, I whispered, looking down at the platinum band that suddenly felt like a shackle. He sized it for me because he'd already bought it for you. Actually, Ryan interjected, his voice cutting through the shocked murmurs of the congregation. He bought it after Sophia turned him down. With money he embezzled from his consulting firm. This revelation sent a fresh wave of gasps through the cathedral. In the front row, I saw Dad's face turn purple with rage while Mom pressed her hand to her mouth in horror. That's not true, Aiden said, but sweat was pouring down his face now, dark stains spreading across his expensive shirt. These people are sick. They're trying to destroy our wedding because they can't stand to see us happy. Are we? Ryan asked, raising his phone again. Because I have you on recording, Aiden. Talking about your real plans for Nicole. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the distant sound of traffic seemed to fade away, leaving only the echo of Ryan's words bouncing off the stone walls. "You've been planning this revenge fantasy since the night Sophia rejected you," Ryan continued, his calm demeanor more frightening than any shouting would have been. "When you found out she was with me, you decided to punish all of us. And Nicole was your weapon." I felt like I was drowning, gasping for air in a world that no longer made sense. Every romantic gesture, every declaration of love, every tender moment between us was being reframed as calculated manipulation. "He told me he was going to marry you, take control of your business accounts and the family trust, then disappear," Ryan said, his eyes never leaving Aiden's face. "He said it was the only way to make Sophia understand what she'd lost. The only way to make our entire family pay for choosing me over him." "Liar!" Aiden shouted, but his voice was shrill now, desperate. "You're just jealous because I found real love with Nicole while you're stuck with a selfish little girl who—" "Stop." The word came out of my mouth like a gunshot, silencing everyone in the cathedral. "Just stop talking." I looked at the man I'd been about to marry, really looked at him for the first time in months. The charming smile was gone, replaced by the face of a cornered animal. His hands shook as he wiped sweat from his forehead, and his eyes darted around the cathedral like he was looking for an escape route. "The prenup," I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "You wanted access to everything. Not just shared accounts but my business, my investments, even my portion of the family trust." "That's normal for married couples," he said weakly, but the fight was going out of him. "And the timeline," I continued, my voice growing stronger as the fog of confusion lifted. "You wanted a short engagement, a quick wedding, immediate access to everything. Because you were planning to disappear." Around us, the congregation was processing the implications of what they were hearing. I could see shock, disgust, and pity warring across faces I'd known my entire life. Mrs. Patterson from next door was clutching her pearls and whispering furiously to her husband. My college roommate Sarah had her hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "Play the recording," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. "I want to hear it." "Nicole, please," Aiden said, reaching for me with trembling hands. "Don't let them poison you against me. What we have is real. What we have is—" "What we have," I interrupted, "is a lie. And I want to hear exactly how much of a lie it is." Ryan looked at me for a long moment, his fingers still hovering over the play button. "Are you sure? Once you hear this, there's no going back." I thought about all the warning signs I'd ignored, all the red flags I'd dismissed, all the moments when my instincts had screamed that something was wrong. I thought about Sophia's tears and Ryan's haunted expression and the way my parents had seemed worried rather than happy about my engagement. "Play it," I said. Ryan's thumb pressed the play button, and suddenly Aiden's voice filled the cathedral with crystal clarity, each word echoing off the ancient stone walls like a confession from hell itself. "She thinks I love her? Let her believe it. 6 months and I'll own half her family's money. Sophia will finally understand what it's like to lose everything that matters." The voice was unmistakably Aiden's, but stripped of all the warmth and tenderness I'd grown to associate with him. This was the voice of a stranger, casual and cruel, speaking about me like I was a business acquisition rather than a human being. "The old lady's so desperate to be loved, she'll sign anything I put in front of her. Prenup, joint accounts, trust fund access, she's already halfway there. By Christmas I'll control everything, and then we'll see how superior Miss Sophia feels when her precious family is bankrupt." The recording continued, each word landing like a physical blow. I felt my knees give way but somehow remained standing, gripping the altar rail until my knuckles went white. The cathedral spun around me, 200 faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of shock and pity. The best part is she actually thinks I chose her over Sophia. Like anyone would pick that dried-up spinster over a 28-year-old beauty. But desperate women believe what they want to believe, and Nicole Hartman is the most desperate woman I've ever met. A sound escaped my throat, part sob, part wounded animal cry. The man I'd been about to pledge my life to had just called me a dried-up spinster in front of everyone I'd ever cared about. The humiliation was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't even process the betrayal beneath it. Ryan's getting suspicious, though. Keeps asking questions, giving me those looks like he knows something. But what's he going to do? Tell Sophia her sister's fiancé is using her? She'd never believe it. None of them would. They all want to see Nicole finally happy too badly to question why someone like me would suddenly want someone like her. The laughter in the recording was the worst part. Light, amused like he was sharing a joke with a friend rather than planning the destruction of my entire family. In the front pew, Mom's quiet sobs had given way to a keening sound that cut through me like a knife. Dad stood frozen beside her, his face cycling through emotions so rapidly I could barely track them. Disbelief, rage, protective fury, and something that looked like guilt for not seeing through Aiden's act. I should have known, Dad whispered, his voice carrying in the terrible silence that followed the recording. I should have protected you. The recording wasn't finished. Aiden's voice continued with increasingly vindictive details about his plans. The prenup gives me access to her business accounts within 30 days of marriage. The trust fund modification goes through in 6 months if she's married. By then I'll have transferred everything offshore, filed for divorce claiming irreconcilable differences and disappeared. Sophia can spend the rest of her life knowing she destroyed her entire family by choosing Ryan over me. My vision blurred as the full scope of his revenge became clear. This wasn't just about the money, it was about hurting Sophia through me. I was collateral damage in a war I didn't even know was being fought. The recordings from 3 weeks ago, Ryan's voice cut through my shock. Right after you signed the preliminary financial documents, Aiden. I'd been suspicious for months, but this confirmed everything. I turned to look at Ryan, this man who'd risked everything to save me from my own naivety. His face was etched with pain, but also with the relief of someone who'd finally been able to unburden himself of a terrible secret. You recorded him without his knowledge? I managed to ask. I had to, Ryan said simply. He was bragging to mutual friends, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate you. I knew no one would believe me without proof. Aiden had been silent during the recording, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost of himself. But now, faced with irrefutable evidence of his cruelty, something snapped inside him. You destroyed everything, he screamed at Ryan, spittle flying from his lips. You and that selfish princess ruined my life. I deserved her. I worked for months to win her over and she threw it all away for you. The mask had finally fallen completely away, revealing the bitter, entitled man underneath. Gone was the charming suitor who'd swept me off my feet. In his place stood someone I'd never seen before. Someone who believed the world owed him whatever he wanted. Deserved her. Ryan's voice was deadly quiet. You don't deserve anyone, Aiden. You're a predator who sees people as assets to be acquired. I felt something shift inside me like a switch being flipped. The devastation was still there, the humiliation and pain, but underneath it, a cold fury was building. This man had stolen months of my life, had made me doubt my own instincts, had planned to destroy my entire family out of spite. With trembling hands, I reached for my engagement ring, that beautiful lie that had sat on my finger for weeks. Came off easily, too easily, like it had never really belonged there. The diamond caught the light one last time before I placed it on the altar with a soft clink that seemed to echo through the cathedral. Nicole, please, Aiden said, reaching for me with desperate hands. You don't understand. The recording is out of context. I was angry, saying things I didn't mean. What we have is real. What we have, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, is nothing. What we have never existed. I stepped away from him, away from the altar where I'd been about to promise my life to a lie. The distance felt important, symbolic, like I was reclaiming myself from his influence. You want to know the truth, Aiden? I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. The truth is that you're right about one thing. I was desperate. Desperate enough to ignore every red flag, every warning sign, every instinct that told me something was wrong. But that desperation, it's gone now. Behind me I heard Sophia's voice, clear and strong. She never loved you either, Aiden. She loves me and I love her. We've been together for 2 years, and we were never going to let you destroy Nicole or our family. Ryan moved to stand beside Sophia, taking her hand with the gentle confidence of a man who'd found his soulmate. You didn't just lose your con game, he said to Aiden. You lost everything worth having. And you lost it because you never understood what love actually means. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Aiden's face crumpled, the last of his composure finally breaking. He looked around the cathedral with wild eyes, perhaps hoping to find a single sympathetic face among the 200 guests who'd witnessed his unmasking. He found none. Instead, something remarkable happened. Dad was the first to stand and turn his back on Aiden, his shoulders set with righteous anger. Mom followed, rising from her pew with dignity despite her tears. Then, like dominoes falling, row after row of guests stood and turned away. My college friends. Dad's business partners. Mom's book club. Distant relatives who'd traveled from 3 states away. The mailman who'd delivered our wedding invitations. Mrs. Patterson from next door, who'd watched me grow up and had probably been looking forward to finally seeing me married. One by one, they all turned their backs on the man who'd tried to destroy their friend, their daughter, their neighbor. The rejection was complete, devastating, and somehow more powerful than any words could have been. In the space of 5 minutes, Aiden had gone from groom to pariah, from the center of attention to completely invisible. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the whisper of fabric as people shifted in their seats. "Get out," I said finally, my voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. "Get out of my church, get out of my life, and don't ever contact my family again." For a moment I thought he might refuse, might make one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his scheme. But then he looked at the wall of turned backs, at the complete rejection from every person in the room, and whatever fight he had left simply died. Without another word, Aiden McCormick walked down the aisle of St. Mary's Cathedral, his footsteps echoing in the silence like a funeral march. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him with a finality that felt like the end of a terrible chapter. Only then did the congregation turn back around, and only then did I finally allow myself to cry. The tears came in waves, each one carrying away a piece of the life I'd thought I was going to have. I stood there in my grandmother's pearls and my wedding dress, surrounded by 200 people who'd watched my world implode, and finally let myself grieve not just for what I'd lost, but for what had never been real in the first place. Uncle Tom was the first to move. My father's older brother, a man who'd built bridges for 40 years and knew something about structural integrity, walked up the aisle with the measured pace of someone who'd seen enough of Aiden McCormick for one lifetime. "Come on, son," he said to Aiden, who still stood frozen near the altar like a statue of shame. "Time to go." Cousin Jake flanked Aiden's other side, both men radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes from knowing absolutely that you're on the right side of a situation. They didn't grab him roughly or make a scene. They simply made it clear that his presence was no longer welcome in our sacred space. "I can walk myself out," Aiden mumbled, but his voice held none of its former confidence. "I'm sure you can," Uncle Tom replied evenly. "But we'll walk with you anyway. Make sure you don't get lost on the way." As they escorted him down the aisle, I heard scattered whispers from the congregation. Mrs. Morrison from Mom's Garden Club was already on her phone, probably calling her daughter who worked at the bank. Mr. Patterson was shaking his head and muttering something about, "Always knew there was something off about that boy." The heavy cathedral doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder, and then there was silence except for the rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats, uncertain whether to stay or go. Father Matthews cleared his throat, his face pale but composed. "Perhaps," he said gently, "we should take a moment to pray for healing and wisdom in difficult times." It was exactly what we all needed. A way to process what had just happened without anyone having to find words for the impossible. As heads bowed throughout the cathedral, I felt Ryan's presence beside me, solid and reassuring without being presumptuous. "Nicole," he said quietly, "I'm so sorry you had to learn the truth this way." I looked at him through tears that made everything blur like watercolors. "You saved my life," I whispered. "Both of you did." Sophia appeared on my other side, her own eyes red with crying. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she said, her voice breaking. "But every time I tried it sounded so crazy. Your fiancé is only marrying you to get revenge on me. Who would believe that?" "I might not have," I admitted, and the honesty of it hurt. I wanted to believe in the fairy tale so badly that I would have found reasons to dismiss anything that threatened it. The next few hours passed in a blur of concerned faces and awkward conversations. Guests filtered out slowly, many stopping to offer hugs or words of support. Some looked embarrassed, like they'd witnessed something too private for public consumption. Others seemed energized by the drama, already crafting the story they'd tell at dinner parties for years to come. Mom and Dad flanked me as we left the cathedral, their protective instincts finally useful after months of watching me sleepwalk toward disaster. "We should have trusted our instincts," Mom said for the 5th time. "We knew something was wrong." "I knew something was wrong too," I replied, stripping off my grandmother's pearls as we walked to the car. "I just chose to ignore it." The reception hall had to be cancelled, 200 meals returned to the caterer, flowers redistributed to local nursing homes. Our family lawyer, Mr. Davidson, called that evening with news that chilled me to the bone. "Nicole, I need you to come in Monday morning," he said, his usually calm voice tight with concern. "I've been going through those financial documents Aiden had you sign and we have a problem." Monday's meeting revealed the full scope of how close I'd come to losing everything. The preliminary paperwork I'd signed wasn't as preliminary as I'd thought. It had already given Aiden limited access to one of my business accounts, and the trust fund modification was further along than anyone had realized. "He forged your signature on 2 additional documents," Mr. Davidson explained, spreading papers across his mahogany desk. "If you'd gone through with the wedding, he could have transferred significant assets within weeks." The investigation that followed revealed Aiden's pattern extended far beyond our family. 3 other women in neighboring counties had similar stories. Whirlwind romances with a charming consultant who'd researched their financial backgrounds before the first date. One had lost her house. Another had been left with $20,000 in credit card debt he'd racked up in her name. "He's a serial financial predator," Detective Morrison explained during one of several interviews I gave over the following weeks. "We've been trying to build a case against him for months, but his victims were too embarrassed to come forward." I understood that embarrassment intimately. Even knowing I was the victim, I felt shame at having been so thoroughly deceived. It was Ryan who helped me process those feelings during one of his regular check-ins. "You weren't naive," he said one afternoon as we sat in my garden, watching bees work among Mom's transplanted roses. "You were hopeful. There's a difference." "Is there?" I asked, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "Because from where I sit, hope and stupidity look pretty similar." "Hope looks for the best in people," Ryan said, his voice gentle but firm. "Stupidity ignores evidence. You ignored warning signs because you wanted to believe in love, not because you're incapable of seeing clearly." These conversations became a lifeline during the dark months that followed. Ryan never made me feel pitted or pathetic. He checked on me like a concerned brother, always asking how I was healing, never pushing for details I wasn't ready to share. "I couldn't let you marry someone who saw you as a business transaction," he said once when I thanked him for the 100th time. "You deserve someone who loves you for who you are, not what you own." The therapy sessions Dr. Martinez recommended were harder than I'd expected. Unpacking decades of feeling invisible, of accepting crumbs of attention, of second-guessing my own instincts. It was painful work that left me exhausted and emotionally raw. "You've been taught to distrust yourself," she said during one session. "To see caution as cynicism rather than wisdom. But your instincts were trying to protect you. The question is, will you listen to them next time?" Gradually, over months of difficult conversations and honest self-reflection, I began to see the experience differently. Not as evidence of my failure but as proof of my strength. I had survived something designed to destroy me. I had trusted the people who really loved me when it mattered most. A year later, I stood in the same garden where I'd overheard Sophia and Ryan's desperate conversation, watching them exchange vows in a ceremony that was everything my attempted wedding wasn't. Authentic. Joyful. Surrounded by people who genuinely celebrated their happiness. I'd been asked to be matron of honor, and standing beside my sister as she married the man who'd saved my life felt like coming full circle. There was no bitterness, no envy, only gratitude for the love that had motivated their painful intervention. "Thank you," Sophia whispered to me as we posed for photos afterward. "For forgiving us. For understanding." "Thank you," I replied, "for loving me enough to risk everything to save me." At 53, I'm single by choice rather than circumstance. I've learned to trust my instincts, to value my independence, to see my caution as hard-won wisdom rather than cynical pessimism. I date occasionally, but I'm no longer desperate to be chosen. I know my worth now, and it has nothing to do with whether someone else recognizes it. Sometimes people ask if I'm bitter about what happened, if I hate Aiden for what he tried to do. The answer is no. I remember him, certainly, Not with hatred but as a reminder to trust myself and the people who truly love me. Because sometimes the best thing that can happen at a wedding is that it doesn't happen at all. If this story of betrayal and rescue had you absolutely stunned, press that like button right now. My favorite part was when Ryan played that devastating recording in front of the entire congregation. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more jaw-dropping stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.